Everybody. Good to see everyone. Welcome to the first MVP webinar of 2025. It's the first one back. Took a bit of a break, but I'm excited for this. It's exciting to see so many people join us. Feel free to drop in the chat where you are joining us from. I am based in Ontario, Canada, between Ottawa and Toronto. It's snowy. It's very bright outside. If you see me squinting, that's probably why. But yeah, looking forward to this. Just generally give it a few minutes for folks to roll in because it looks like we've got still lots of people joining. But yeah, looking forward to this topic today.
And
Let's see where people are coming in from.
everyone's messaging in. So we've got a lot of people. We've got Brazil, Brussels, we've got Portugal, nice and warm. No snow there.
Yeah, lots of warm places.
And then there's Berlin.
Not warm.
Wisconsin, Oklahoma from UK. Hello, everyone. Spain. Oh, lovely. California, Madrid, France, Dublin.
This might be the most actually international one I've seen in quite a
Yes.
while.
Yes.
It's kind of
Thanks for
cool.
sharing,
It's good to
guys.
see so many different people.
Yeah,
Right.
it's always nice to see different places pop up in here. New
And I
York
think,
City.
yeah, there you go. I'll be there next week.
Oh, nice.
Um,
I've only been to New York
yeah, I
once,
get to.
but
I've been once, very briefly, and this will be the longest stay I've had there. So I'm going to see what I'll get up to at night. Not quite sure
you're
yet
not gonna
what the
be
plans
bored.
are, but I'm
That's
sure we'll
good.
find something. Yeah,
Yeah, plenty of options
as
there.
long as it's not cold. Exactly. As long as it's not -20, I'm happy. Which it could be. So who knows? All right. Oh, Morocco. Nice. Okay.
Yes. All right.
Cool.
So
So we'll
just
get started
yeah.
soon. Whoop, go ahead.
Sorry, just before we get started, I just wanted to share with everyone that this webinar is recorded and that you will receive the slides and a link to this recording from me tomorrow. And then once the presentation is over, you can ask Mallory any questions that you have in the chat or the Q&A section. And I will also share a Slack link in case you're not part of our platform engineering community. But yes, I'll give it away to you now, Mallory.
Perfect. Yeah, so there'll be lots of stuff inside of this webinar. So just feel free to write your questions in the chat or save them towards the end, and Olivia will help me get through them. So generally what I like to try and do with these is take 30 to 35 minutes to go through the content. Sometimes it takes a little longer, but I want to leave as much time for questions as possible because there's always lots of interesting ones. So with that being said, we'll get started. Today, we're going to look at the minimum viable platform. And what this is it's a proven success framework for platform engineering initiatives. This is something I use every single day in my role at Humanitech, but it is also something we talk about in the platform engineering community as a best practice. And we'll look at exactly why that is inside of this webinar. So who am I and why am I here? My name is Mallory Hagan. I am the principal platform architect or advocate at Humanitech, as well as the head of customer success. So my job is very much not just about making our customers successful with the platform orchestrator that Humanitech offers, but also a big part of what I do is helping them be successful with platform engineering as a whole. A lot of change management stuff inside of that, as well as coaching. And you will also see me as part of the platform engineering community. A lot of the time now, I am teaching a big part of the certification course. There's a lot of practical experience, obviously, that I have that's very hands-on with building platforms and also with developer experience because I am a full stack developer by background. So lots of interesting information that I can bring to the table. So I'm always happy to answer those questions. You can get in touch with me by email, or you can find me on the platform formerly known as Twitter. I really don't log into it very often, so probably best to try email or the platform engineering community on Slack or LinkedIn. Otherwise, yeah, that's generally where I hang out these days. So what I want to look at today is a couple different things. So I want to take you through a little bit of what the minimum viable platform is and why it is more than just a confusing acronym. When I came up with it, kind of as a concept, I took the idea of an MVP in the product sense and really ran with it. And we'll go into why in that section. We break the MVP into 4 phases for the sake of repeatability and to also make it really easy to follow. So we'll go into those and what those are as well, and how you can start thinking about applying them to your own scenario. After that, we'll also look at some of the pitfalls. So there are some common things that go wrong inside of platform engineering initiatives, and I want to show you why following this structure will help you avoid those right out of the starting gate without a ton of backtracking needed or thinking too hard about how to avoid them. It's just sort of intrinsically part of this process. And then finally, before we do Q&A, I want to touch a little bit on what happens after MVP, because I get asked this all the time. This is all great, Mallory, but what the heck do I do once this is all said and done? So it is a very valid question and definitely something I will take you through today. Like I said, throw your questions in the chat. There should be a Q&A function, and we will get to those at the end. You can also save them to the end if you want, and then Olivia will help me walk through these. So let's start with sort of the fundamental basics, which is what is the minimum viable platform and why should you consider one? Realistically, what they are is a way to show value inside of a platform engineering initiative very, very quickly. The way you do this is by following a pathway. And this is a pathway that we've laid out that works. We've gone through this 1,000 times. We've seen this stuff work, and we've also seen what doesn't. So from that information, we've created a very defined way of approaching starting a platform engineering initiative and showing the value of it very quickly. So when you do this, it's going to enable a couple of things. It's going to enable you to find a team of folks that are willing to pioneer and lead the way in not just innovating from a technical perspective, but from an organizational change, a developer experience perspective. This is often a combination of people from your platform engineering team, your DevOps team, infrastructure, folks on the developer side as well, maybe even have a developer experience team. But generally, this process will allow you to get those people together and identify those core folks within your organization. It's going to also enable you to build a first version of your platform in the context of the pioneering team that is working on it. So that could be, maybe they have you guys have an application you want to try this out with. Maybe it's something that, you're building greenfield. You're wanting to try to build some new containerized applications that focus on that 12-factor app model. And perhaps you want to do things right for that from the start, and then eventually look at migrating. This is kind of a great way to do that. But you're also going to, even if that's not your case, build a representative first version of this thing around what already exists inside of your structure and inside of your organization. So you can do a greenfield or brownfield approach with this, and it will work quite well. You'll also walk out of an MVP with a product-like roadmap for iteration and growth. And what's really critical with anything in platform engineering is to treat that platform like a product. At the end of the day, your customers are your developers. They're the users that consume what you are building for them. So the best thing to do in order to enable long-term success is to really understand that iteration and growth trajectory. Looks like someone can't see my screen. I'm assuming, can everyone else see the slide deck? Just want to double check on that. Okay, interesting. Might be worth leaving the call and popping back in and trying that out. Sometimes Zoom is really weird with this stuff. So just give that a try. But good thing for letting me know that, because sometimes stuff happens. I have questionable country internet at best. All right, so give that a try, and we'll carry on here. So as long as you guys can see the slide deck for the most part, that is great. We'll also get you a copy of this. Okay, so one of the other things we're going to want to do after we build this product roadmap is we're going to also make sure inside of the MVP that we understand who the influential stakeholders are. When we look at adopting anything in organizations, whether or not it be technology, whether or not it be workflows, ways of thinking, we want to make sure we understand who is able to influence the decision-making in the space and who is able to help us get adoption. With this is no different. Once you find those stakeholders, you're going to want to get them excited very quickly. You're going to want to onboard them to the concept very quickly and maintain that over time. So one of the big things that kills platform engineering initiatives is a lack of momentum, or momentum that starts really, really well and then staggers, falls off the wheels and ends up completely falling over the edge of the cliff, and you will lose the initiative very quickly. If you can't keep that momentum going and that excitement going, it is really, really hard to get this to work. One thing that I really like about approaching things this way, starting slow and slowly scaling, is that you avoid having to win over every single technical team. So you don't need to worry about immediately getting every single person to buy in, every single developer team to buy in, because they all often have different opinions on things. This allows you to scale sensibly. You can take what the MVP does philosophically and the steps it takes and reapply it across multiple teams, and you can do it time and time again. If you're able to grow slowly and sustainably, it is much less risky for everyone involved, and it is much safer. And teams also feel a lot better about onboarding at a slower pace. So you don't need to go ahead and get everyone on board immediately. You can take the time to find the teams that are really interested and will really see value and benefit in using a platform and go from there. So in terms of designing the MVP, this can sometimes be the biggest hurdle people have to jump over. And a lot of it is because they forget these three core principles. So it's important to remember as you're starting to design what you're going to build for the minimum viable platform that it follows these three principles. So the first is that it's representative. It should be representative of the basic resources, the basic application structure, and the components that are common across the entirety of your technical estate. So this is stuff like making sure you're including common database types, making sure that the CI/CD that is basic and fundamental to a lot, if not all of your organization, is taken into consideration. There may be a common application structure you use. So you could be one of those groups of people that divide stuff into a front end, a back end, and a data layer. Make sure that if you're using a sandbox application or picking an app to start with, that it's one that follows that structure. The other things to be considerate of are things like ingress, DNS, and all those fun networking things that come with deploying anything outside of a local machine. The reason why is because sometimes you need to consider stuff like security here, and you need to think about things like private cluster deployment and all that other fun stuff that tends to come in larger enterprise environments. So make sure what you're doing is representative, and if someone were to go look at it, they could see their own context inside of what you've built. It also needs to be repeatable. So consider the MVP a quick start for iterating, building a platform, or even just thinking about it as a whole. When you go to onboard other teams, you'll probably follow a similar structure. You're going to follow the same sort of phases in understanding what those teams' needs are and building that into the platform. So think of it like a quick start. Think of it like an easy way to onboard new applications, an easy way to onboard new teams. Make sure the process that you follow around our guidelines is repeatable. Finally, it needs to be iterative. And I can't stress this enough. You will not solve all the technical problems of the world in the first go. And if you try to do this, it will fail. I promise you, I would stake a lot of money on it. So what you need to do instead is think about iteration. Think about that MVP concept from product design, minimum viable product. It's why it's called the minimum viable platform. Start with the fundamentals. You can iterate and grow it from there. And you're going to do that based on user feedback. Start small, think of the future on the horizon, and know that, to get to scale, it requires commitment, but that commitment through iteration is much easier than commitment to a whole lot of things all at once. So the 4 phases of the MVP are how it's broken down in a way that allows it to be repeatable, easy to understand, and easy to follow. What do they look like? So we have 2 sort of non-technical phases, and then we have the more hands-on integrating phases. Discovery is where you're going to start, and this is where you're going to understand technical outcomes that you're trying to achieve, as well as discover and look at the golden paths that you want to build. I just published an article on platformengineering.org about golden paths. I encourage you to check it out if you want to explore what those really are. Basically, a golden path enables a developer generally to achieve an outcome, to achieve a task in a way that is fairly self-service, fairly painless, and is the easiest way to approach a problem or to approach a particular need. A golden path should not be a golden cage, but it should be the thing that you incentivize them to do. So if it is follow trajectory A in order to achieve outcome B, that is what you want to start understanding. So part of doing that is understanding what the pain points for the teams you're building for are and what the overall goals of the organization are and how it relates. These all tie together. The other thing you want to do in the discovery phase is align on project management and project planning. So I often see kind of, and we'll look at this a little bit, misalignment between project managers inside the application teams versus the platform team. You really want these folks to be aligned because otherwise nothing will get done. So in phase one, you want to spend a lot of time doing that and understanding what you're going to do inside the rest of the MVP. Phase two is integration. So here's where you're going to build the baseline of the platform, get all of the infrastructure configured, get the components connected, the CI/CD in place, be ready to get the infrastructure pieces like databases set up. Once you're done with that, you'll be able to move on to deployment, which is phase three. Here is where you're going to get those applications onboarded. Maybe it's just a sandbox, maybe it's a couple simple workloads. You're going to do that here in order to test out the entire thing and make sure that the pipelines work the way they intend to against the golden paths you laid out in the beginning. Inside of phase four, we call it adoption, but what it often ends up being is adoption planning. So here you're going to do some end-to-end flow testing against those golden paths with the teams that helped you understand what those golden paths needed to be. So if you worked with developer teams on understanding the most painful processes that you want them to fix, this is where you're going to have those teams come back and test the new flow and compare it to the old one. In this phase, you'll also do demos. You'll probably showcase your platform to people. You're going to start to do adoption and roadmap planning. So starting to think about what comes next, and I'll give you some guidelines for this in a bit. What's important to remember, though, is to keep your infrastructure and apps simple, representative, and scalable. Do not try to reinvent the wheel. Do not try to do something really exciting and new with your applications. If you are a Java shop, don't suddenly go and start throwing a Rust application inside of your MVP because it's not going to make sense to anyone else in the context of their day-to-day. It's fun, it's cool to play with stuff like that, but that's not the point of the MVP. I like calling out Rust developers. It's fun. Okay. Avoiding pitfalls with built-in solutions. While I caffeinate here, I want you to think about what could kill a platform engineering initiative really quickly and what you might have seen in your own organizations that has maybe steamrolled your platform engineering initiative or at least stalled it in its path. Does anyone have any quick examples they just want to throw in the chat? Because I'd be curious to see what people have experienced in their own day-to-day. Don't all jump out at once. Lack of adoption, over-engineered platforms, competing priorities. Yeah, I see definitely that a lot. Over-engineered platforms, I see a ton of too. Yep, new product rollout and support of the same. That's something too. That's that competing priorities, right? Like you're wanting to build this thing, get it done, but you also have to support the existing services. Fear of change. Ooh, yes. See that every day. Switch solution strategy when a simpler, newer solution is discovered. Yep, that can be challenging. MVP doesn't support all use cases. Yeah, that is a very valid critique of the MVP process. But what's important to remember is if you do that adoption planning correctly, which we'll talk about, that roadmap planning, you can avoid a lot of that. But yep, that's a very good one to bring up. Legacy, we're going to talk about legacy too. This is recorded and live, just for your reference. So you will get a copy of it as well. Continued addition of features. Yep, it's sometimes really important to gatekeep a little bit what you're doing here, but that's why treating it like a product is so important. Lack of proper resources, managing debt and adoption within the same team. Yeah, all of this stuff is really valid. And I think if you look at the MVP process as a whole and you try to follow it as closely as you can avoid a lot of these. These are all really accurate to what I see every single day. So funding. Yeah, funding's sometimes easier said than done to counter that one. But the most common pitfalls, and a lot of what you guys are talking about fits into these 4 buckets, can be avoided by following the MVP structure. And I'll kind of explain why. The first pitfall is that rushing to complexity, that trying to get too much done too quickly. And realistically, what you need to think about instead is that iteration is okay. Continuous improvement will get you there in the long run. Ease is slow and steady wins the race kind of thing. Because I promise you, if you rush to complexity, you'll fall flat on your face. What tends to happen in those scenarios is that there's nothing that ever comes out of it. It's that software is never done, and there's nothing different here. And if you try to get to that complexity too quickly, you'll burn yourself out and you'll miss other things in the background. That leads really well into the second one, which is focusing only on tools and tech stack. It is so important to remember that platform engineering is not just about tools, technology, and toys. It is actually about solving problems. So if you focus in on golden paths and you really measure against usage and adoption rather than just, hey, we've implemented ABC tool, you're going to have a better time proving the value because the value isn't necessarily in the tools you choose. It's in the way that you apply them and that the way that you make them accessible to people. And that's really quite important in the long run. Someone else mentioned adoption. So building something that no one will use. And this happens quite a bit when you don't ask the right questions in the beginning of the discovery phase and you don't try to find out what people's actual pain points are. If you don't do the right discovery, if you don't treat this thing like a product and you don't choose the right level of abstraction, you're just going to frustrate people and they're not going to use it because it's not built for what they need or what they want. So what I want you to do instead is focus on those users. They are your customer. Focus on the right level of abstraction that makes sense in the context of improving productivity, having actual impact on their day-to-day, and increasing satisfaction. I cannot stress enough how important it is to actually talk to people in this process. Yes, I know it is very hard. But there's a lot of value you can gain by just asking people what is tough about their day-to-day and what they would like to improve. So focus in on that, build something that's actually useful, not just something that you're grabbing out of thin air and throwing at a wall and hoping it sticks. The last one I want you to think about is the pitfall of thinking that developer experience is only about developers, because it's not. It goes so far beyond developers, and I see more of this every single day, and I'm laughing because I literally just had this conversation with someone this morning. Developer experience is so complex and touches so many different areas. You are building a community around solving problems for people. It just so happens to be called developer experience because developers are the primary folks that will interface with it. But platforms are about cross-cutting concerns. Platforms are about thinking how the entire technical organization and anybody that has to interface with it can have an easier time understanding what's going on, self-serving the information they need, and also self-serving the resources they require. So try to think about it that way. When you start thinking about it more holistically in that way as well, it's easier to align with business value. And once you can align stuff with business value and business initiatives, it is actually easier to get funding. To come back to what Tanvir pointed out, that funding can be hard. Tie it in to business value. Tie it in to some sort of initiative that the business has, and it will make your life much easier. So I think that covers a lot of what you guys talked about. Now, there's an interesting one here about the adoption one. Previous company hired a brand new team to build the platform. This new team moved on with consulting anyone in engineering about what was needed. That's definitely something we've seen where people have brought in new teams and really consulting anyone. And I think that's a good approach because those folks don't have the bias necessarily that everyone else has. But you can still build a good platform engineering team from inside of an org. You just have to have the right mindset. And that mindset is counter your own bias, ask people what they want. I'll just answer this question really quickly. So how technical can an MVP be? A Figma project or a simple Django project? Well, I would always recommend something that you can not just show to people from a demo perspective, but something they can actually get their hands on. So even if it's just running a simple deployment, in our context, for MVPs, we do a lot where it's a sandbox application, but the customer wants to have their developer team try their current process for doing an ephemeral environment. What does that process look like? And compare it to the one that they've built with the MVP. That's generally, what is going to give you the most value and the most important impact out of the MVP is if someone can actually put their hands on it and compare a process before and afterwards. So, yeah. Oh, that's kind of cool. Sam Newman spelled out DevX or DX as delivery experience. That is a really cool idea, and I want to follow up on that because I like that. It's nice. But yeah, absolutely. It doesn't have to be overly technical, but it should be something people can touch. There are some great resources out in the world to get started with building a platform and to do an MVP. We cover actually two different versions of this inside the platform engineering certification course that you can get your hands on and play with. And I actually just did that with the folks in the current cohort last week. So there's definitely stuff out there to get you started if you're not the most technical team to begin with. Okay, let's talk about going beyond MVP before we finish up and get to some questions, because it looks like you guys have some great things to talk about. So I want to get to that. Someone mentioned legacy earlier, and this is where this comes in. And when you think about going beyond MVPs, you're going to have to think about stuff like the challenges of enterprise adoption. And yes, this is focused on enterprise, but there's a lot of stuff in here that is also applicable to folks outside of that kind of big enterprise space. There's chances are there's some things, not just politically, but also technically, that fall into the umbrella here for a good bunch of you. So when we look at enterprise adoption in platform engineering, we tend to see that the technical complexity gets way bigger. The technical estate covers a lot more ground. There's a lot more distribution on it as well. I have seen some crazy stuff like hundreds of AWS accounts for one organization. And that's the sort of stuff you're dealing with when you walk in the door. These enterprises also require a lot higher level stakeholder management. So you're kind of jumping beyond just getting a single signature for an entire org to adopt something like this. It's more than just one person going, yep, this is great. Chances are there's a lot of layers you have to think about, and there's a lot of stakeholder management you're going to have to do. If this is not something you're familiar with, I recommend finding someone that you can rely on that can help you with this, because it is much more challenging in order to get things up the chain and approved. Adoption at enterprise scale, conversely, also must be well planned and well managed. It cannot just be done by the seat of your pants. It is a much more formal process. Generally, there's a lot of requirements you have to jump through in order for an organization to change like this. There's probably thousands of demos you might have to give. There's a lot of things you have to think about in order to get adoption at scale. Generally, when we look at designing how we look at the roadmap or do the roadmaps for post MVP, we say, you want to address 80% of the needs and keep those 20% outliers for later, or maybe, think about them at a different time. There are occasions where those 20% of outliers, so let's say they're kind of a weird technical thing, they don't fit the mold of what the rest of the org uses. Maybe it is that Rust app in a Java org, but they might be very critical. They might be business critical, and you might need to consider those sooner than later. So that is something that might come up that you'll need to think very consciously about in the process. And the other thing is that legacy tends to haunt these estates. It can cause you a lot of grief when you start thinking about legacy. So we'll look at what you can do to kind of get around that here. In terms of how you can counter the challenges that I've mentioned, what's going to be really important is stuff like engaging those high-level stakeholders about the value and the return on investment and what you're doing early on. I know it sounds boring. I know I'm an engineer. Why should I talk about things like ROI and value? But I promise you, if you want technical initiatives to take off, you have to be able to sell them internally. So there is a level of internal sales that you have to become comfortable with, or have someone inside of your platform engineering org that is comfortable doing it. Planning around technical complexity with focused, phased project plans and roadmaps is going to be critical, especially at enterprise. I think everyone should do this, though. I'm a big fan of, even if it's just a Jira board, tracking what you're doing. That is critically important, and making sure that key stakeholders have access to it or are walked through the status of each piece. I mentioned it before, but making sure there's alignment between platform and application teams is incredibly important. And this is on the project management perspective. If these folks don't align, it is not going to work. Start thinking about that 20% that you might run into early on and build a migration strategy to support them. This is going to be cyclical. We'll look at this a little bit more in a minute, but that is something to think about. And finally, consider where and if those legacy systems are going to fit in, and if there are initiatives to look away from these. I will talk about this in a minute in more detail, but it is just something to highlight. When you engage your high-level stakeholders, the most important thing for you to do is to think about outcomes first, and start doing this early. Share the project plans with the folks that need to see them. Help them, get them to help you define success criteria and outcomes. Get them to give their feedback on it. Make them be involved in this process. If you align those outcomes with business priorities, things like being revenue driven or time to market, cost control, there's all sorts of stuff you might want to align this with. You're going to have an easier time engaging with these people and getting them on board. Regularly do reports on progress towards those success criteria and outcomes, even if it's just a little light bulb moment where someone said, hey, this is a way better way to do things. This is great. Those are the sort of things that you need to report up to those stakeholders. Demos and updates often is something part of something called a QBR in an enterprise. So it's like a quarterly business review. Maybe your team gives a quarterly presentation about what they're working on. This is a great time to do that, or find some other management level meeting to get people excited about what you're doing. And finally, here, just show ROI as you see it. Time is money, and any process that reduces the amount of time for something to be done is a big cost saver. And if you can quantify that time return on investment, you are going to be in a good place. In terms of aligning that project management strategy with migration plans, I recommend really having that strong collaboration between both the platform and application project managers. If you don't have this, you will never get organization-wide adoption because they'll never see eye to eye. So they should be aligned on the outcomes, the goals, the objectives that you're trying to achieve, and collaborate on building those timelines, building those phases, and looking at the roadblocks that come up and working together on finding solutions. In terms of the migration plan, the best adoption processes that we see are the ones that do this really well. And they don't just consider the what, but they also consider the when and the how. So what you also need to think about here is, in parallel to building sort of that logical timeline, make sure that you're also mapping out how the technical complexity of the platform will change with that timeline across time. So as you're going on and onboarding more teams, you're going to need new features, you're going to need new golden paths for people to walk down to address what those teams require. So the best way to think about this is in iteration cycles. So each cohort of team or applications that you bring on is going to have a specific set of needs, and try to group those people accordingly to make this process easier. In terms of legacy services, just a quick note on this, it does require deeper thinking as an organization as a whole. So it's probably outside of just the scope of platform engineering. Some enterprises have plans for getting rid of this stuff, others don't. If the plan is to gradually sunset legacy services and replace them, I would say start those projects as greenfield on the platform. Be best practice from day zero, not just day one, actually. And that's a cool opportunity to be able to do neat stuff with greenfield and to get those applications just on the right foot from the time that people start working on them. If you are going to be stuck with legacy services, I will tell you right now, they'll probably never align with platform engineering as a philosophy, fit into that 12-factor app model. Maybe eventually, once the rest of the organization you have has transitioned to this new way of doing things, things are streamlined, there's more time, there's more money, it might be possible to then sunset them. But honestly, don't waste your life worrying about when you'll get those legacy services on if they don't plan on getting rid of them, because chances are you never will. So save yourself the agony. In terms of going beyond MVP, I wanted to sort of sum this up in a bit of a chart for you. If you do things very intelligently and you do early adoption planning and design well, it is easy to go beyond MVP. And what we have is this cool little flowchart diagram for where you're at. So when you start platform engineering, you're going to basically take your developer needs, the best practices in the industry, and the existing toolchain you have, and build a proof of concept. Realistically, that is this baseline improve of the MVP and what we call production readiness, which is seeding and scaling the idea. That is, as a whole, a proof of concept. Going beyond proof of concept into full-scale adoption is about evolving and supporting the platform. So as you get new adopters, you're going to need new features. And every time you do this, you're going to just evolve everything by getting feedback and prioritizing it accordingly against what you need for your new adopters, your new feature, or your new teams, and the folks that are already using it. If you follow that, honestly, product lifecycle, it is much easier to plan adoption, but to also be prepared for it. So you'll get a lot more done when you do this intelligently, rather than just trying to build everything all at once and trying to satisfy the needs of the entire org all in a period of like 6 weeks. Doesn't really work well. If you do things well, we tend to execute MVPs at Humanitech in less than 4 weeks. We have this process down to a T now. And when we walk into a customer's organization for the first time, we are very quick to get in to understand where things are at and to help them build this thing out. It does not take long actually to do this if you follow the methodology. Going beyond MVP into production readiness and full scale adoption, we're seeing right now just following our own parameters, we can get people to a production grade platform for the first few applications within a month or two. It's very fast. And it really does follow that idea of iteration and continuous improvement as a mindset, and treating the platform like a product. The hardest lift is honestly, and most of the time, the change management stuff, and getting teams to accept change. The technical stuff really isn't that bad. So in terms of adoption planning, how you can be successful and get stuff done at this level of speed is through these 5 key concepts. So make sure you're defining your objectives and goals. Keep this in mind throughout everything. Decide the cohorts and prioritization for onboarding people to the platform. Make sure you're doing a discovery for every cohort that you do. And I tell you this because it's going to be different and it's going to have changes. And you may find that you're able to kind of do future discovery and start aligning your roadmap very early on in a very strong way. You're going to need to develop an internal marketing strategy. As much as I hate saying it to engineers, you're going to have to figure this out. And it is very important. How do you get people excited about this thing and get them ready to go? And then finally, once you've done all of this, you'll be able to put together and deliver an adoption model and a plan for scaling. If you want budget, you have something like this ready to go, or at least a fundamental version, or at least the start of what this needs to look like. It's much easier because it shows that you're thinking towards the future and that this isn't just a flash in the pan experiment and fun toy that you want to build. So that's what I would definitely recommend doing. A great quote here is, if you want something you've never had, you must be willing to do something you've never done. And this applies not just to platform engineering teams, but I think also to developer teams. If we want automation, if we want self-service and standardization, we need to be willing to try something new. And I think doing the MVP methodology really gives people the opportunity to try something new in a safe way. It is budget friendly, it is time friendly, and it is organizationally friendly too. And it gives you the tools to be able to be successful without having to completely reinvent the wheel or throw yourself full time into trying this out. So good luck on your platform engineering journey. I am here now to answer your questions, and we'll get Olivia back in to help me out with this. And yeah, fire away.
All right, question time. Okay, we've got a few already. Thanks for sharing your insights. I get the whole PSAP and the high-level one-liner describing this approach. If platform engineering is about solving problems, then what are some concrete structure ways to get this outcome-based dialogue towards golden path started?
Ask the hard questions. Ask the hard questions of your technical organization, which is stuff like not just, DORA metrics, which are great, by the way, I love them, but it's also stuff like subjective measurement of how do you feel about deploying on a day-to-day basis? What bothers you about it? What could be better? Asking the challenging stuff and not being afraid to open the door for people to be critical of their experience. That is really trying to understand the outcomes. And what you'll find is you can generally group them into 2 sort of bubbles. You'll be able to group them into kind of an automation requirement or a standardization requirement. And you can really formulate outcomes based on those 2 buckets. And you can tie them into business initiatives. Things like increase time to market, be more competitive, decrease costs. If you can really align the objectives that you're trying to achieve with the context of the buckets that you find of problems. And don't just ask developers, ask managers, ask security, ask, infrastructure and operations people. You'd be surprised how often you find that the way people think other teams might do things is misinterpreted. You may find you have complete organizational chaos, which happens. But honestly, the way to really start is to ask the challenging questions.
Okay. And do you have or know any resources about examples with concrete tools to guide the decide/discovery phase?
Yeah, actually, so we have them in our documentation on Humanitech. A lot of the MVP process that we use is publicly available. Let me just grab that for you. So in the discovery, I like to ask a lot of questions. I'm very annoying, you can tell. Um, what I want to do is to make sure that I'm really covering a lot of bases with things. So inside of phase one, I'm going to start doing a couple different things. So let me just find it here. Do do do. Mm-mm-mm. There are a lot of, I'll actually just give you the MVP guide as a whole, and you'll see there's some videos. I'm just going to post it in the chat of me going through our phase. I'm going to walk you through the tracks as well. So we break things down beyond just phases into technical, business, and security tracks. So there's some stuff you can look at in there to get you started. Um, Yes, I would follow that for sure. And I think what's also going to be really important is establishing your own internal timelines and finding the team that's going to work on this thing. I would say that's also critically important. But yeah, this will give you a good start on the process that we tend to follow.
Okay. Is proof of concept different than MVP?
Opinions vary. I personally say yes. Um, I feel like I'm allowed to because I do this every day, but I will call an MVP a part of a proof of concept. An MVP is a very scaled back version of a proof of concept, whereas a proof of concept, in my eyes, in building a platform, should be able to show something all the way through to production. So that's where we go into what's called production readiness. We have a methodology for this as well, but the idea being at the end of that, you have a production grade platform that is ready to scale. That is a proof of concept, and just people need to go like, yeah, I'm ready to go with this. Like I said, though, opinions vary on this. That's just mine. An MVP is part of a proof of concept, but generally you'll want to go beyond the MVP to get a more robust POC. Um, but it does really, yeah, it really does depend on what your needs are too. For some people, this is enough. You know, I've been in massive organizations, thousands of developers where just the MVP is enough. And they're like, you know what? Perfect, let's go. Others need a bit more time and a bit more of an actual like in-depth proof of concept.
Okay. Any hints for running a successful discovery phase? So you kind of
Yep.
answered that.
So my biggest hint is very psychological, and it is honestly, don't be afraid to ask those hard questions. Um, you really want to understand the pain points people are facing. You really want to be empathetic to those as well, because you are there to solve those problems as a platform engineering team. That is your job. Your job is not to build a platform because some dude at Google told you to. That's not what you're there for. You're there to solve a problem. So what I would recommend is yeah, asking those hard questions, but making sure you're understanding your entire stakeholder base. So not just developers, talk to managers, um, talk to security teams, talk to finance, talk to infrastructure and operations people. Like there's so many different people you want to talk to in the discovery phase. And we sort of do it collaboratively with the teams we're working with and help them do that. But yeah, that's where you want to start.
Okay. Can you please share the slide deck and recording? Yes, we will do that. I can answer that
Yeah,
one.
yeah, absolutely.
Then we've got another one. Let's assume you're staff to a project where the customer decided to use the code base from one product to use it as basis to become the platform for multiple products. How would you
Mhm.
approach it?
It depends. Does that work? Is it viable? I mean, I'm not a fan of reinventing the wheel, but I'm also not a fan of giving myself more work. I'm a work smarter, not harder person. So if reusing that code base requires a lot of manual effort in order to configure anything, it's probably not a platform. A platform where you're reusing a code base would be essentially a scaffolding type functionality, which is very commonly built in, but it isn't just copy pasting. There's a lot of other stuff that goes into doing that well. So it depends on if that process you're using now works.
Okay. How do you get leadership to understand the need for a platform and get investment, at least for the initial run? Are there resources that explain the price of inaction?
Well, that is a fantastic question. the big thing is an MVP is part of the process of helping with that. So you can very minimally execute an MVP yourself. Like that's why we literally have the program up publicly. You can also come to us at Humanitech. We will help you go through it. But it's openly available for you to go through because the whole point is that you can get buy-in and adoption or towards adoption. But my biggest piece of advice is really understand how to tie it back into business values and initiatives. Return on investment, I would say, would be based primarily on time. So get an understanding of what it costs for a developer to wait a week in order to have a ticket for a new database. What does that cost? What does that opportunity cost? Is what we would often say in customer success. Like, what's the opportunity cost of that taking a week? And if you could change that, if you could 50% that time, if you could somehow get that down to like a couple days, ideally you get it down to nothing with a platform. What is that worth? I think that's where to start.
Okay, and we've got some questions in a chat as well. Is it possible to
Mhm.
develop an MVP knowing nothing about coding? How long should we take?
Is it possible? It's going to be really hard because the idea is that you have a demo at the end. There are some tools that you could realistically use, but you would have to have a fundamental knowledge of exactly what those things are. So you'd have to understand what is a CI/CD and why is this particular tool doing this? What's the value of doing it this way? It's very hard to articulate the value of doing a platform without being able to show it. And you can explain the value of a platform without coding knowledge, absolutely. But to be able to show it, you have to build something. What I would suggest is maybe, I mean, we have so many MVP webinars. There's so much information out there now about doing this. I would maybe just even start with going through some of that and putting together a like, hey, here's what we want to try, but we need the resources to be able to do it. Um, Chances are someone in your engine organization who can, putz around with CI/CD, who knows stuff like Terraform, who's able to look at a YAML file and not cry. That's the kind of person that you need usually to build one of these.
Okay, and then Rabi's asking tooling, off the shelf or open source?
Well, I'm going to be biased here, because I work for a vendor in this space, but it actually does depend. And I just went through some of this in the platform engineering course, but there is some good open source stuff out there, but it depends on what your needs are. There's also some really good there's some really good products in this space that are worth investing in if they fit your needs. So, I'm a fan of open source stuff, but I'm also a fan of innovation, which sometimes is not cheap. Sometimes you got to pay for stuff, and it really is about finding what works best for your scenario and your budget. But yeah, I'm obviously a little biased here.
How FinOps fits with platform engineering?
Great question. FinOps tends to want to be involved in that context of having a single pane of glass. So as a FinOps person, if I look at a platform, I want to understand exactly the financial outlook of what this platform is achieving, how it's saving me money, how it's costing me money. I want to be able to know that the standardization and automation built into it are giving me the tools I need in the places I need them. So for example, making sure things are tagged accordingly so that I can allocate them to the correct cost center. Making sure that there's monitoring in place so that I can understand if something is starting to cost a ton of money. FinOps also really likes to get involved in discussions about standardization. So what is the base level of RAM you want to offer someone when they're spinning up a particular service? Like what are the resources you want to be able to allocate to someone and how much baseline cost do you want to associate with that? Like FinOps is a really interesting team to talk to when we start doing these because of sort of the questions of standardization and automation and how that relates to the work they do.
Okay, and the last one in the chat. I'm building an MVP and want to know whether to focus on no code development or core development.
I'm going to be biased here as well. Always focus on core development work first. I don't care what you're building. Always focus on the core work. Remembering that I'm a full stack engineer of 20 years. Oh God, that's horrible to admit. Getting very old, but 20 years. And I will say that every time I've thought about a question like this or seen someone ask a question like this, at the end of the day, it will bite you in the ass if you don't do core development work first.
Okay, so that is all for questions. Guys, do you have any more for Mallory while you have her here? Pop them into the chat if it's easier, or use our Q&A option.
Someone did ask about a base budget for this kind of project. Tough. I did want to touch on that really quickly. It is really tough to give a number for that because it really depends on what you want to do with it. You can do a lot with open source stuff, which is free, but the time to build it isn't. So that is sort of something to investigate. Now, I know what it costs to work with us directly on this stuff, but that is not applicable to every scenario. So that is something you would really want to look at exactly what you want to achieve. It may be worth reaching out to a vendor and saying, hey, here's what I want to do. What do you think this is going to cost me? Because that's something, we or other vendors could potentially help you out with. But from a budget perspective, you could go hundreds to thousands, not counting your time. Your time is worth money though, so make sure you always account for that.
Okay. It looks like that's
Cool.
everything.
All
Thank you
right.
so much, guys, for joining us today. And thanks so much, Mallory. Everyone's loving the presentation. So all good.
Perfect.
Okay, guys, thank you so much. And thanks, Mallory. And we will see you soon.
All
Bye.
right. Thanks, guys. Have a great day.